Welcome to the Nordic Mythology podcast. I'm Daniel Farrand, owner of the company Horns of Odin. As always, before we jump into today's show, I do have to plug our Patreon. And instead of telling you what you're going to get this week, I'm going to tell you what it does. So the support from the Patreon is literally what keeps the podcast going. It's how we keep making it. So none of the money that people pay for Patreon goes in my pocket. It all goes to production of the show and how we keep it at a high level. And it literally is how we get to do this week in, week out. And without the Patreon support, we couldn't keep the podcast doing. So that is why the podcast going, and that is why I do plug it every week and we push it on social media and all those things, because it is literally the lifeline of the podcast. So if you can go over to patreon.com/Nordic Mythology podcast, go and have a look. It starts from £3 a month, less than a cup of coffee. There's a bunch of different bonus material you get on there. You get the Q&A episode, which is every single week. It's a bonus episode every week with our guests where you sit down, have a little chat after the show, and the guests get to ask their questions. And a lot of the time there's stuff that I've missed. And if you can't, then 5-star rating, positive review wherever you get the podcast, and then a like, share, just all that kind of stuff. But yeah, let's get into today's show. So this is a topic we've not covered much on the podcast. I think we did a topic on Ireland maybe around episode 5 or something. So this was a long time ago. So my guest today is Dr. Niamh Wycherley, who works in the Department of Early Irish as a medieval historian specializing in the early Irish church, and she hosts the Medieval Irish History podcast. So Niamh, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Willie, for having me.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for coming on. Like I said, we've not touched on Ireland enough. And in recent weeks, I've found that there are so many, even though we've done so many episodes and I've spoken to so many people, there is so many gaps missing that we've just completely overlooked. And because the Viking Age is such a big topic.
Yeah, of course. And as we were kind of saying there earlier, we have done absolutely no preparation for this in that I have no clue what we're going to be talking about, but I'm excited about it. And Vikings are just a huge topic in Irish history, Irish medieval history. And anybody who's been to Dublin or visited kind of various parts of Ireland, but especially Dublin, it's like half the tourism industry is based on the Vikings.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So like, you just it hits you in the face in Dublin. So growing up in Ireland as a kid, the Viking history is just a huge part of kind of the stories and the everything you learn in school, and then the school trips. A lot of them to do with different like Viking museums, or as I said, there's a number of big things in Dublin. Like there's this Viking splash tour, and there's this big Dublinia museum, and anyway, there's loads of things, and they're all kind of centered around the Vikings. So it's just kind of part of our DNA.
Yeah. The Vikings are very marketable, aren't they?
So marketable. Like, and there's so many companies use,
oh yeah,
and it's because they're cool, but it's all, and yeah, like, and then anytime you Google Vikings, it's funny that the Minnesota Vikings come up on some things now as well. And the horned helmets and all of that. But yeah, it's huge because, our Dublin and a number of our towns, Cork, Limerick, Waterford, Wexford, they're Viking towns. They were founded originally by the Vikings as kind of trading posts. So, as I said, it's just a huge part of our history here.
I don't know if this is just me just being maybe just a pig-headed English person, that whenever I think of the Viking Age, I think of I think probably most people do. You think of England, like the whole battle the vying for taking the whole of England, and you have Lindisfarne, and obviously the Battle of Stamford Bridge at the end, and a lot of it does center around England. And it probably is a fallacy of the podcast that we've just overlooked Ireland for so long, even though it had such an impact, and you had the route going down and obviously down across the top of Scotland and down past the Isle of Man, and there was clearly a huge amount of contact there. And I don't know, I feel like it's overlooked. So even when you're saying there's such a big part in Dublin, that surprised me. I've never been to Dublin, unfortunately. It's somewhere I would love to go. And yeah, I feel a little bit embarrassed, I guess, that it has just completely gone overlooked, and not even And I'm sure it's not just me either. I'm sure there's so many other people whose focus is on England.
Yeah, well, I'm laughing because it's a bit of a thing in Ireland that you're not taught anything about any Irish history in England. So
Okay,
I
well,
would forgive you. I would forgive you for not knowing anything about the Vikings, which was ages ago. But you know, people are surprised at how little I don't know how little in your schools and stuff that you learn about kind of more recent history between
mhm.
Ireland and England, but we won't even go there. But
I
I'm just
think
saying that that's the reason why I'm laughing because it's we have a completely different perspective, you know,
mhm,
where like in more recent times it was like we were the little listen, we've been inextricably linked, I have to say. So Ireland and Great Britain has a really complicated past that we're not going to cover today,
I don't think
right?
we could cover it
On
today.
the Nordic Mythology podcast. But the thing is actually, right, if you're talking about context and everything, before the Vikings were even on the scene, Ireland and Great Britain were part of the same world. So just you go back, you know, all the way into kind of the written past in these islands, right? Um, there was always people coming and going between the two places, and there was always connections, and that they changed over time, and we're incredibly connected still today. And the whole kind of Viking period is just one piece of that whole kind of long history,
Mhm,
and even like the earliest kind of date, kind of the marquee kind of date in Irish history is when St. Patrick, okay? That's like
mhm,
our big thing. And he wrote two documents that survive. They're like our two earliest surviving written documents. And he's the most famous Irish person in the world, kind of, but he's actually a Briton. He's a British person, probably from what was Wales, what's now Wales. But it's kind of like one of our first kind of written testimonies about the contact between Ireland and Britain, and you know that there were these slave raiding parties,
mhm,
and you know Patrick was one of these slaves who was taken from kind of kind of a wealthy-ish kind of house. In the time, you know, when the Roman Empire was kind of pulling back and pulling
mhm.
out militarily from Britain. So it's just really interesting. You know, you know you had slave raiding. You have all these references kind of in Roman sources that you have Roman Britain, and they're kind of like frustrated with the Irish and the Picts, you know, raiding Roman Britain, and
Mhm.
so we have a really colorful past between the islands and before you even get to the Vikings. But when you look at the Vikings in either place, in Ireland or in Great Britain, they're inextricably linked, you know,
Mhm.
because it's when you get into the political stuff, like the big leaders, like the you know the big dudes who are kind of fighting, kind of amassing kind of big armies and trying to take over big territories. It's the same. It's the same guys in Dublin and in England.
Mhm.
So it's all tied in together.
Yeah. Okay. This is how the podcast works, by the way. That I'm going to have questions that pop up into my head, and they're likely going to be unrelated to anything that we are meant to talk about. And my first one is I have to ask about St. Patrick
Yeah.
because every St. Patrick's Day, I get two camps on my Facebook, and one is people celebrating St. Patrick's Day, and the other is pagans talking about how the snakes were really pagans, and St. Patrick kicked all the pagans out of Ireland. And I just want to know what's true or what we know is true. And do you have I don't know how often I get the chance to ask somebody who might be able to give me a definitive answer.
Yeah, so I just saw there in the chat someone said Ivor the Boneless. We'll get on to Ivor the Boneless or Ivar the Boneless. But yeah, everything has to start with Patrick. My fault for bringing him up. But
No, don't worry.
no, no, he listen, it's all untrue and all true. So essentially, you have a real historical individual. I'm just going to try and give you the whole legacy of Patrick
Mm-hmm.
in like 2 minutes. He's a real person. We have his own voice. We have his own kind of writings. So his experiences of being like a teenager in Roman Britain, kind of living his life, getting nicked by this like random slave trader, sold into slavery into the west of Ireland, and like living, herding kind of either some kind of flocks, like maybe pigs or sheep, eventually escaping, getting back to kind of Roman Britain, well, you know, that kind of world, and, you know, Gaul, and then deciding to go back to the Irish to spread Christianity. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So he converts loads of people in Ireland to Christianity. He saw that the end of the world was nigh, and that he had to convert as many people as possible to Christianity, so that they would be, so that the end of the world could come, right? Because this
Hmm.
Ireland, the west of Ireland, was the very edge of of the world, right?
Okay,
They
yeah,
didn't,
yeah.
nothing beyond that. That's the edge of the world. So he had to convert as many people as possible. Um, then what we get a little bit of a gap. That's going on in the 5th century, okay, the 400s. Then in the 600s, what we see, there's a bit of a gap in the written sources. We're not exactly sure what's going on in the 500s, but what we know is by the 7th century, the Irish church is highly sophisticated. It's been built along Roman lines. It has very close contacts with different churches in Great Britain. It's very sophisticated, has a huge network, and one of the biggest churches is Armagh, and Armagh claims authority partly because it says we're the church that was founded by Patrick. And all of these other churches and all of the other people who were converted by Patrick, they all belong to us too. So this is where our reach, we have a really far reach. You all owe us kind of allegiance, right? Now, you also have other churches like Kildare, which is a church of Bridget, and they're saying, no, 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 Bridget is the most important saint. Kildare is the most important church. And there's kind of Iona, which was the patron saint of Iona was Columkill or Columba. That's
Hmm.
also in the mix. There's a lot going on. Ultimately, Armagh wins out, okay? And Armagh becomes the most powerful church in Ireland. But part of that whole story is there's different authors writing lives of the saints to try and, for lots of different reasons, but one of them, a small part anyway, was promoting their own church. So Armagh had kind of two, there's one guy in particular who's quite famous called Muirchú, and he wrote this amazing life of Patrick, right? Where he paints him as kind of this Marvel superhero,
Hmm.
goes and fights the pagans, right?
Oh,
And
everyone just needs a really good hype man, don't they? In history, that's all you need. Is
all
just
you need.
yeah,
I was literally asked that on a different podcast about on for Bridget's Day, and it was like, "What makes a saint?" And I was like, "A really good biographer, like just a really good hype
yeah.
man, as you say." Um, and so Murphy does an amazing job. He composes a brilliant story that Patrick converts that goes up against like the King of Ireland, and they have a showdown at Tara, and it's slain, and ultimately he defeats his so-called druids, the term actually used as kind of magi, kind of magicians. Anyway, he converts him, and the whole of Ireland converts to Christianity, right?
Hmm.
And then you get, because Armagh becomes the most powerful church, and Patrick is inextricably linked with that, then there's loads and loads of other stories because people love stories about the saints. So the term for that in the medieval world is hagiography, and there it's literature about the saints. So they're not supposed to be factual stories. So when you say about, oh, apparently Patrick drove the snakes out of Ireland and the snakes are pagans, and yeah, they were. And you have all of this allegory and tropes and lots of different things going on in literature. Same
Hmm.
as everybody when you're studying English in school, when you're studying Shakespeare or whatever, and it's like you don't take it literally, and your English teacher is explaining to you all the
Okay.
meanings behind it. So you can't take these as historical, trying to historically represent St. Patrick's life. It's
Okay.
there's layers and layers of meanings.
Hmm.
And if you're familiar with that type of literature, you can see all the meanings. Like you can see, oh, this is a reference to this story in the Bible. It's really
Hmm.
obvious, to anybody who's read the Bible. Like, so he's a real person. He's also kind of a saint. He's the patron of the Church of Armagh. He becomes the patron saint of Ireland, and he's used in lots of different ways. Um,
Hmm.
and there's lots of different layers of meanings. But the real Patrick is completely unidentifiable with the stories about
Okay. Okay. So because this is we live in a very meme culture, don't we, where people get a lot of in quotation marks knowledge from memes, and I see them all. Like I say, I'm St. Patrick's Day all the time about how kicking the snakes out, and I mean, even people just saying, "Oh, well, there would have been this many pagans in Ireland, and it's the death of so many," and it's like, is it though? So that's kind of what I wanted to clear up
Well, I
as
don't
it.
think there was any, as in the thing about Ireland. So because Ireland wasn't actually militarily part of the Roman Empire, it has quite an interesting history. So, it's just kind of on the Roman frontier. So you
Mhm.
have a lot of trading links between Ireland and the Roman Empire. but it's not subsumed kind of administratively, or you don't have the military. So you actually, it's a fairly bloodless kind of the conversion to Christianity. Um,
Hmm.
so you so-called, you can use the word pagan, but pagan was actually this derogatory term which was used by
Yeah.
Christians to just refer to, kind of like common folk kind of thing. So it was a bit of a derogatory term. We don't really know what kind of religion that would have been practiced in Ireland before Christianity came along. But there's, as I said, it's a fairly bloodless conversion. It's just a gradual conversion, where people kind of, were hearing the word of Jesus and they were like, okay, that sounds good. And also you had it becoming part of the power structures. So you have the
Hmm.
kings converting, and then you have the church becoming really enmeshed in the political structures.
Hmm.
So it became a real top-down thing quite quickly as well in Ireland. But you know, you kind of, it was a slave-based society. It was highly stratified. Um, you've kings at the top, you've slaves at the bottom, and loads of people in servitude in between. You've some free people, you've some traders, you have lords and ladies. You've an aristocracy, and then you have the kind of monarchies. And within that whole system, I'm sure whatever your faith, let's say your religious faith, you kind of were beholden to whoever's thumb you were underneath, and if they said,
Okay.
okay, well, you're worshiping,
Hmm.
you're venerating Jesus now, or this one true God, you kind of, in public, you did what you were told.
Yeah.
What you did in private is hard to ascertain.
Yeah. We see that with the conversion of the Vikings as well. There's things of where it's you're Christian now, but kind of in your own time you can kind of just do what you want, but you just kind of got to do what the overseer says. So he gets his little thumbs up from the Christian church and the little perks.
And it's all tied into, land as well, and, power and patronage and
Yeah.
so many things. But also, I think sometimes we we kind of, especially is when we look at then the Vikings in Ireland and everything, and if we get into kind of religion and that, like you can see the appeal of a kind of this monotheistic religion of like,
Mhm.
so Patrick in those first writings, he talks a lot about women and slaves, and he says that they were coming out to listen to him. And if you can just try and imagine what it's like to be living in a society, and obviously there are a lot of people still in the world who are living in this kind of under these kind of restrictions, where your definition in the law is that you're not equal, right? That you're
Mhm.
either a slave or you're someone really low down in society. And if someone comes in, like Patrick and all the other people, he wasn't the only one. There was many other missionaries, and they come in and they say, actually, my God loves you just the same as the king. You're
Mhm.
just as good in his eyes, and life um, on this earth is really difficult for you, but your reward will come, in the next. So like it's a really powerful message if you're a slave or you're a woman, you're in a society where your activities are restricted. So
Mhm.
we see that in the writings of Patrick, and we see that later on as well. So I think sometimes we have to understand that there's a few different things going on, that the
Mhm.
appeal of the message in this society was, really important as well.
Yeah. Religion has a really good way to kind of make things seem good
Oh
over
no,
here,
yeah.
or like,
Yeah.
like really kind of just help things through. And you see, it's not just Christianity; it's all religion has a way to like fill the gaps that people need at a certain time in history. And you go, okay, well, this is really shit now, but whether it's
Yeah.
but there'll be a heaven, or in some religions like a reincarnation. It's like you're this now, and it's not really good for you, but you're gonna be good to us, be good to the gods now, and you'll be reincarnated as a higher born next time round. So thumbs up, be good.
Yeah.
Religion has a way of doing that.
Yeah, but I think again we just kind of from just to understand the society, and then to understand like the society that the Vikings come into, it is highly stratified, it's hierarchical, and it's patriarchal,
Hmm.
and everyone is working within that system. So the
Yeah.
church slots into that really well, and
Hmm.
embeds itself. So you have like the local king, you'd often have like the abbot or the bishop of the church is related, to him in some shape or form. They're coming from the same dynasty or the same extended family, or they could even be brothers.
Hmm.
So there's kind of there's a few different things going on at the same time. But understanding that society is key. Like you were right when you said that there earlier, like it is important when you're seeing, okay, so the Vikings, what are they coming into? Because
Hmm.
it's really interesting when you look at the history of the Vikings in the early history of the Vikings in Great Britain and the early history of the Vikings in Ireland. And they both go off in different directions, kind of, because they start to make territorial gains in England
Hmm.
and they don't make territorial gains in Ireland.
Okay.
And like there's probably lots of different reasons for that that I'm not qualified to answer. But, one of the things is potentially that you didn't have a clear centralized kind of government or a clear centralized kingdom in Ireland where if you defeated one king, the whole country or a massive amount of territory fell to you.
Hmm.
And you see that in the Irish sources, they will start to make some, in particular, Viking leader will start to make some inroads. But first of all, straight away, you see alliances forming so you'll have like a king in Leinster, which is one province in Ireland, will ally with a Viking leader so that he can defeat his enemies further north.
Hmm.
So you have that happening really quickly in Ireland. And then what you also see is, yeah, they might defeat one guy, but then the next week they're defeated by the king, the next kingdom over. So they ultimately never get a firm, they try really hard. They sent fleets of ships down in the rivers into
Hmm.
Ireland, into the heart of the country, and they absolutely ravage all the heartlands and all the rich farmland in the middle of the country. But ultimately, different kings or different kings band together to defeat different Viking leaders. So they head over to England. Like if you chart it, it's really interesting. You see like certain guys getting defeated in Ireland, and then the next year, it's tied into the Great Viking Army, for
Hmm.
example. Um, and then they make these big inroads in territory in England because you can defeat one king and get a lot of territory.
Hmm.
Which is just it's a lot more centralized the power was in England at the time. So it is fascinating to study them both if you study them both equally.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
Two places because it's all part of the same world. And that's the other thing. Sorry, I'll let you I'll let you ask
No, no,
something
no, no, no,
else.
please.
That's another thing is that there's a lot of scholars now who are starting to study. If you're studying in these areas in the Middle Ages, you have to see the Irish Sea as it connects Ireland and Great Britain. So now
Yeah.
it's kind of a barrier, and you have to fly from, Ireland is an island, and you have to fly or get a ferry to get out. Whereas the road network, especially in certain parts of Great Britain, obviously you had the Roman roads. We didn't have that. What did the
Hmm.
Romans ever do for us? Um, so we didn't have the road system, but you didn't either. You didn't have the full road system either, and obviously in Scotland, let's say for example. But the the seas anyway, the seas connected people. The seas provided, especially in summertime they provided easy links, and there are
Hmm.
parts of Ireland and Great Britain, parts of like kind of Scotland and Wales and everything you can get over quite easily, quite quickly via the sea. So it's something that connected territories actually. So you kind of have parts of Wales that were actually probably like connected by the same dynasty with parts of Ireland, southeast of Ireland, in certain parts of medieval, like kind of early Irish history, and then you have parts of Northern Ireland and Scotland were all, part of the same kind of territory as well. So I think we have to, and as I said, there's a lot of scholars doing that now, that the Irish Sea in itself, that's a zone, and that's how we should be studying it. And we're looking at it like from modern day understanding
Yeah.
of
Okay.
nation states, and we're like, well, no, Ireland is separate to the UK, but actually those are
Yeah.
very recent political divisions,
Yeah.
and they didn't exist, in this time. So there was a lot of connections, and the Isle of Man is there, and there are different places. And what we see with the Vikings is that they build up this whole empire, where Dublin is on the east, is on the it's on the east coast of Ireland, but it's on the west point of this empire that they have.
Right. Okay.
And it's connecting because they're able to transfer loads of goods easily via ship.
Hmm.
So that Irish sea zone really connects this Viking world.
Yeah, it's really interesting because, like I say, we do think of the seas now as just a bit of an inconvenience. You have to fly over it or get a ferry, and it is just this modern world we live in. Whereas they were probably a bit more excited to be able to get across the sea and go and trade, get new things that aren't available in your own land, or go and raid and take things.
And they were just so good. They were so fast,
Mhm.
and again, very much so not my area of expertise, but part of the people who are trying to explore and kind of reimagine, what are the reasons for why the Vikings became so famous and so proficient and everything. Why now, like why at the end of kind of the 8th century, and then through the 9th century do they become such a big deal? And obviously part of that is their prowess on the seas
Hmm.
and their shipbuilding and everything. So to them, they're in this period, they're better than that,
Yeah.
else.
Hmm.
They're able to, and you're able to move so large numbers across the sea. And in the industrial evolution, then we got trains.
Yeah.
But they didn't have trains, obviously. So when you're moving goods, you can't do it over land. You're going to do it.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So yeah, it is a complete different way to change your mindset of thinking how it would have been back then. That's a good point. You did, if you wanted to move a large amount of goods, you didn't have a lorry.
Yeah.
You had a horse and car, and you could get so much on that, and you still have to go across terrain. Whereas if you can go across the sea, it's pretty much going to be the same. Yeah, you could get a storm and it can be choppy, but it's pretty much what you're going to get, and you can just.
And then you can get attacked so easily as well on land. So like you're moving people, you're moving herds on foot. Obviously, the really big thing as well in medieval Irish literature is cattle raids. Cattle was like a big unit of one of the important kind of units of currency and stuff. And you have people kind of moving them for grazing and moving them for trading and moving them for paying tribute and taxes and different reasons. But you're moving them along, and you need to have how many people protecting them because someone to just come in and easily attack you. So the sea, if you're good, on the seas, well, you're not as vulnerable to attack,
Mhm.
from people just poaching things from
Yeah.
land.
Perfect. Okay, let's go back to the start of like when the Vikings come to Ireland, and then because I would love to talk to you in the future, maybe on a separate episode, just on Ireland in general. Like I say, I don't know enough about Ireland. We do start to introduce maybe an episode a month where we go completely away from the Viking Age and don't talk about Vikings, and we just look at something else. So last month we did prehistory and just looked at like prehistoric peoples. So I'd love to do something like that with you, just about Ireland and medieval Ireland, and look at Irish history and teach all our listeners about that if you'd be up for that
Yeah,
maybe at
love
some
that.
point.
Yeah.
But for now, let's go back to Vikings. Before we get into, I guess, the Vikings landing there, we touched on it a little bit about the landscape. So I assume, is it pretty much a Christian?
Yeah.
Country's guess is not the right word because it wouldn't be a unified country at the time.
Well,
But
it is like the texts refer to, the Irish refer to them as themselves as, yeah, they saw themselves as as
okay,
Irish and Ireland. But in terms of kind of government, for want of a better word, you have lots of kings.
okay,
So you don't just have one centralized kingdom. You perhaps even have as many as 185 kings.
okay. I was going to say like in England, but in England, what they
No,
have,
no.
I don't know, 6 maybe. I can't
Yeah,
remember
no,
exactly.
so
Five,
there's a
six.
huge amount of kings, but then you have provincial kings. So you have, maybe you could have, it depends because it fluctuates all the time, but you could have, a handful, like 4 or 5 provincial kings, and then you have kings of essentially varying degrees and sizes, right?
Okay.
But you do not have one single, we take out this figurehead, and
Hmm.
therefore um, we've defeated this country or this area, because there's lots of other. You may just get a foothold in one particular place.
Hmm.
So you may make inroads in the east part of the country, and that has no impact on the west at all.
Okay.
So it doesn't mean that it's kind of politically fragmented, lots of kings, but it doesn't mean that it was weak, and that's what sometimes people would say, oh, it's all just like, like people, like rooting around in forests, and it wasn't, they were really sophisticated, uh,
Hmm.
and really tied into networks all around what we would count as like now, like Western Europe, um, and importing loads of fancy stuff, for centuries and centuries. So the Vikings are coming into a country that is, as I said, it's there. You have the aristocracy at the top, many kings who kind of were vying for power versus each other. This is really interesting when the Vikings come in, because the Vikings
Hmm.
really throw the cat amongst pigeons. And some guys, as I said, super quick, are like, "Oh, I can." Hi, where are you from? Grant, cool. Is there any chance you can help me? I can just pair up with you and we can defeat the king.
Hmm.
So let's do that. Like, let's fight the King of Meads, and then we defeat the King of Meads, and then one of us kill. You kill the Viking guy, the Viking guy kills you. But they come into this country where it's lots of king. There's lots of kings. It's very hierarchical. So you've loads of slaves at the bottom, kings at the top, and you've different guys, different kings who have a lot of power at different times.
Hmm.
Um,
I'm,
but it's
I'm,
very
ass-
rural.
I was gonna say, I'm assuming there's no
Yeah.
such thing as a north and south divide back
No,
then.
no, but you do have kind of there is a kind of a thing where kind of the south of the country and the northern half of the country are kind of expressed in texts as the kind of the northern half and the southern half. It's not how you
Okay.
would see the north now. So the north now is kind of more like the province of Ulster. Um,
Hmm.
and the boundaries were always shifting, and they were kind of the real power base. And during a lot of this period when the Vikings came in, the Enel were this big dominant dynastic family, and they were constantly claiming they were the kings of Tara. You might have heard of Tara, which was this royal site in Meath, but they were all often claiming that their king, that the king of the Enel, was the king of all Ireland. But the guys in the southern half of the country, or the King of Munster, was like, no, I don't. I'm not bowing down to you. I don't
Hmm.
do anything. Um, so it's a rural economy. We didn't have any towns. So the Vikings
Okay.
are coming into it. So again, it's really interesting when you compare the Vikings going into England, where you can get a lot of riches, or you can like
Hmm.
defeat a town, and that's a really big deal. You don't
So
have
how does that work? Not having towns? Is it just a bunch of villages? But if you have like a bunch of little houses in a place, does that not become a town?
it's such a huge debate in
Okay.
scholarship on medieval Ireland. Like there are no towns. You have lots and lots of like ring forts, and you have lots and lots of small settlements.
Hmm.
And what you have wealth kind of centralized in the big churches, um, some of which were monasteries, and
Okay.
probably weren't how we would imagine a monastery is, somewhere, kind of secluded and remote. Some of them were much more like just a big church, settlement with a
Hmm.
bishop and with loads of people there. And there's this big debate in my field, which I won't bore you with, about whether you could consider that a monastic town or like a church town. And then you've, loads of archaeologists saying, no, it's not a town, because a definition of a town is, and I'm like, yeah, what's the definition of a town, by the way? Can anybody agree on
Yeah.
that? And but that you don't have a town is somewhere where you have like regular trading, where you could come in on a Monday and get some meat, buy some meat, or you can
Okay.
whatever. And you have people who are not living off the land, right? So town is somewhere where you're going to have like traders and craftsmen and smiths and different things who
Hmm.
are not living off the land. And a lot of scholars would argue that you just didn't get that kind of thing in Ireland before the Vikings, and some would say even before the Normans that you don't get that in Ireland.
Okay.
But I would definitely say that the Viking towns were towns. But yeah, so we didn't have any. We didn't. I think though you have to understand is that a lot of towns were kind of introduced in a number of places in Western Europe and in Great Britain, kind of during the Roman Empire, and if you don't have that military, so you have a town growing up around a military base because you
Okay.
have a big military contingent that aren't living off the land. So they need to buy, they need to be fed, they need to, be able to get their shoes looked after. They have money, they're being paid, and
Mhm.
they want to like pay for goods and services. Whereas if you don't have a big, massive kind of standing army, and anyway, again, I'm wading into an area that I know very little about, but I think when you take the Roman Empire out of it, towns kind of evolve in a different way, or
Mhm.
settlements evolve in a different way. So the kings, there is a question that I'd love to kind of know, is where exactly were the kings living? But they were very kind of peripatetic in that, they traveled around, they were always traveling around their kingdom. And they would have been put up, it was part of Irish law that you had to offer them hospitality. So, if the king pitched up in your house, you have to feed him and all of his men, of which he
Oh,
had a massive retinue.
yeah.
Um,
I bet they hated seeing him
yeah,
come.
yeah. But
Yeah.
it's like all the, I don't know if you've gone around to when Queen Victoria went on tour places, and she came on tour to Ireland
Yeah.
and stuff. And like people, all these kind of big houses were bankrupted if Queen Victoria came and visited. You had to put on all these amazing spreads of, food, and put up, all the people. And
Mhm.
Queen Victoria is the only one that kind of stands out to me, but I'm sure it's like you have kind of a longer history of all of the kings and queens. You have all of
Oh,
these
yeah.
big houses having to like house all the horses, feed all the horses. Um,
Mhm.
so yeah. Anyway, long story short, there weren't any towns when when
That's-
the Vikings came in. There were no towns.
Okay, so there's no towns,
Yeah.
and is it all Christian at this point, or are there still some
It,
pre-Christian
it,
peoples?
listen, short answer is yes, it's all Christian, right? We don't know how many people were actually venerating something else.
Okay.
You just don't really get an insight into people's interior lives or
Okay.
what someone actually believed in. But yes, in terms of the church was massively powerful, completely
Yeah.
entrenched, getting taxes, tithes. It was completely part of the fabric of society.
Hmm.
Um, People, as I said, may not have believed in Jesus Christ, which is the definition of a Christian. But the Catholic Church, the Christian Church, the Roman Church was certainly
Okay.
huge. Yeah.
Perfect. So when do we first see the pesky little Vikings turning up?
Yeah, well, funnily enough, I always start when I'm teaching. You have to start with Lindisfarne,
Okay.
and Lindisfarne is kind of like the first kind of historical date
Hmm.
for these guys. So 793, the Letters of Alcuin, that's where I always start
Yeah.
teaching. I don't know if you've discussed the Letters of Alcuin here before, but just kind of, reports of this massive attack on the Holy Island on Lindisfarne off the
Hmm.
coast of the east coast of Northumbria, of northern Britain, of northern England. And that's in 793. And you get that recorded in the Irish annals. So another thing that we have for Ireland for this whole period, which you don't have to the same extent in England, is we have these chronicles called the Irish Annals. There's loads of them, and they were recording everything contemporaneously at this time. Now, they're still biased, as in when they were being written down, they were biased, and they're biased in the
Hmm.
way they're manipulated later on, right? So don't get me wrong. I'm not saying, well, do you know what? Actually, they're kind of the same as news stories now are incredibly biased,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Everything is,
Yeah,
I think everything
yeah,
anyway, nothing can ever be completely neutral.
yeah. And they're not even trying to be neutral, in fairness. And we shouldn't read them as, that they're being
Hmm.
neutral, because they're very much so being written within kind of churches. And
Yeah.
they're so what you see is the record of the islands of Britain are devastated by the heathens. right?
Oh, okay.
So that's like the first dun dun
Yeah.
dun, right? And you can
Hmm.
just hear the background music. Um, so that's like the foreboding, right? They're coming for us. Uh,
Okay.
they're devastating the islands of Britain and they're coming for us. And then in 795, you get like the first reference, historic written reference to the Vikings in Ireland. Now, interestingly enough, like, and you can see their route, you can see their route from Scandinavia over to kind of area around, yeah, like around Scotland and the Scottish Isles and then down to Ireland. And it's just this really, apparently it's easier to navigate. It's a much safer route than traveling down the East Coast and between kind of Northwest Europe and kind of the East Coast of the UK. Apparently it's like safer, it's a safer, more navigable route to go around Scotland and go down Irish Sea. Anyway, um,
I guess it would depend.
maritime
May-
experts.
Yeah, I guess maybe it would depend where you set off from as well.
Yeah,
If you were coming from Norway, I guess you would almost be in line with
yeah,
northern Scotland anyway, so you'd just come
makes sense.
across and around. Whereas if maybe it was Danes, because I think I'm right in saying that pretty much all Vikings, or at some point, a lot were just called Danes, and it was a blanket term for all kind of peoples coming raiding rather than
Well, actually, so
separate
interestingly,
up.
so all of the first, so we're using the term Vikings, and that in itself, I've loads of academic friends that would say, Niamh, you can't say Vikings. It's such a problematic term. But then I've loads of other kind of Viking experts who say, listen, it's problematic, but it's fine. It's the best that we have. Everybody knows what you mean when you say Vikings.
Hmm.
But it's a much more recent term, and it's not a term that they use to describe themselves.
Hmm.
And how the term that I was actually used in the Irish sources is initially they're referred to as heathens. So they're referred to as heathens and then as the foreigners. Okay, so the foreigners are coming to attack. The
Hmm.
the heathens have attacked this island or that island, or
Okay.
this church or that church. So they're being marked in religious terms.
Yeah.
They're being called the Genti, the Gentiles, the non-Christians.
Okay.
That's how
Right.
they're being
Okay.
defined. And again, that tells us a lot about the people who are defining them. So they're seeing themselves as Christian and these people as non-Christian.
Yeah.
And then, as I said, you see they start to be referred to as the Gaul, the foreign, right?
Hmm.
Um, so it's not necessarily the attacks that are strange because you have a lot of attacks between Irish different kingdoms on churches and between churches even attacking each other.
Hmm.
So it's not necessarily that they attacked churches that was shocking, but these were people they didn't know who weren't from.
Okay.
They weren't from here.
Yeah.
They have a different religion and they speak a different language, and we're not used to them. We
Hmm.
know the Saxons, and we know the Picts perhaps, and we know the Britons, and we know the from Gaul, or we know from different areas, but like these are the foreigners. And then you start to get references, maybe after they've been around Ireland for at least a generation, right? Then you start to get things like the Nordmanni, right?
Right. Okay.
The Norsemen, the Lachlanif, right? So you get kind of definitions like these are people coming from the north, coming from the areas that we now identify as Norway. Um,
Hmm.
but when you get into things like the Danes in England, it's always referred to. It's like it's the Danes that are the problem.
Hmm.
In Ireland, you get a reference, really, really interesting references. So, well, before I get onto that, but it's just really interesting to see the terms that are used to describe them
Yeah.
because it evolves and they're not defined in terms of, this term Viking kind of means like a piratical activity, that you're going raiding. And it doesn't represent all Scandinavians and it doesn't represent like all Danes and all Norwegians at the time. Um, and it kind of just identifies these certain people who are involved in this particular activity. And but they come, so the first references, but if you were just reading the historical sources, the written sources, which in fairness is all that'd be my bread and butter. But then when you compare that with the archaeological evidence, actually you see that there was probably people who we would identify as Scandinavian actually in Ireland before that point. So before the 795, so maybe even a generation before that, there was actually these guys in Dublin. So there's been a number of excavations in Dublin where they've carbon dated the graves to, a few decades earlier than 795. So what we probably have is that there was a lot of trading activity going on around
Yeah.
all of these islands for a good while.
Yeah.
But
I think that's a huge misconception that a lot of people probably need to realize is that there was trade long before the Vikingish side. Like the attack on Lindisfarne wasn't the first time Scandinavia and the British Isles met. You had people living in it's like Norfolk area, that kind of the Danes who lived in that area, and obviously, like you say, in Ireland. There was trading. They knew of each other. It wasn't this new thing. It's just this new raiding aspect was probably a new thing where it was like, okay, we're just gonna come and take this stuff from these unarmed monasteries that you have just sat there with all this
sat
lovely
there.
stuff
Yeah.
in.
Yeah, and it's funny. And I love you. Have you seen the Vikings TV show?
Yes.
And I love the way how they depict, it's really entertaining how they depict the raid on Lindisfarne. And I know archaeologists are always up in arms, but that's not what it was like at all. But what I like, I think they got the essence of it. I like the essence of it in that they were, they came in, they were like, there's like precious items, like shiny, like gold and silver and gems, and no one is protecting them. Like this is crazy. So I like kind of, yes, it didn't go down how they depicted in the Vikings TV show, but I think they, yeah, as I said, they kind of captured that. Listen, these were really vulnerable. You have these
Yeah.
islands with loads of flock. They had scriptoriums, and they needed loads of calf skins and vellum and stuff to write all these books, and they like were fairly rich. And all the other thing that they had was just loads of people, right? So loads of people that they could easily abduct and sell into slavery. And again, what I'm saying here is that this is already a slave-based society.
Yeah.
They're not inventing slavery and they're not inventing trade, but by God, do they get good at, are they like super efficient, right?
Yeah.
At selling these things. And
I always think it's really interesting how the slave aspect of like the Viking Age is pretty overlooked, as in it doesn't really get mentioned that much when it comes to, because again, Vikings are cool. They are in modern day, they're just cool. They're this kind of, I guess, like a hyper masculine warrior culture you get, but also you have the whole image of equality with women, which is problematic in itself. But you have this whole thing of like equality and strong female characters, and there's never really any mention of the sheer volume of slave trade that went through. And obviously, when we say slave trade, this is like, it's not the slave trade most people will associate with when you think of the slave trade. It's from the British Isles, from Ireland in particular, and just taking of people back to work the farms, work whatever they needed to do.
yeah, and again, I can speak to it kind of best in the Irish context, but there is similar stuff going on in the contemporary jurisdictions, where yeah, slaves were kind of an integral part of the economy, and human beings were property of other human beings, and they were just sold. So you have traces of, and there's a lot of exciting work where you can see that like Irish female slaves are being sold, really are ending up in a kind of like the Middle East, and then you have like silver ending from the Middle East, like ending up in Ireland and stuff. And you different places are trading in different items, and in fairness, it is something that we would be kind of conscious of enough in Ireland because Dublin was a big slave trading port.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And it's funny in that thing that I said at the start, Dublinia, it's a really cool it's a tourist kind of museum and exhibition and everything, and like school tours and kids go in there and talks about all the Vikings and Ireland, and you can dress up, and it's one of those kind of interactive museums. And I go around and I'm like, oh, all of these facts are incorrect, but it's a really good place to visit. But like part of it is where they have that you can put on the slave chains like on your children. And there's like, here's a little slave boy, a little slave, and it's like, oh my God, like,
Hmm.
and it's like
Yeah.
these were real people. And this is,
Hmm.
and obviously slavery continues to, in various ways today. So it's not something to just be like, oh, this is what it was like in Viking Dublin. But it was a big trading port, and one of the things that was traded was slaves in
Hmm.
and out, different, you see a lot of slaves like if we haven't gotten onto Ivar the Boneless, but in some of his activities, you see them, they don't make the inroads they wanted to make in the interior of Ireland. And you see probably the same guys then being active in the 860s and 870s and
Hmm.
80s in Great Britain. And you see loads of slaves being taken from Great Britain and then those slaves being brought to Ireland to try and retake Dublin. Anyway, we haven't gotten anywhere near that yet, but but it's just kind of, we can move on from slaves, but it's a fundamental part of this history, and it's
Hmm.
the things that they were getting from these initial raids,
Yeah.
and
I
one of the things that they're trading.
I have an episode booked in the future that's going to be just quite a heavy topic, I guess, but it's just slave trade in the Viking Age.
Yeah.
So for anybody that is interested in that, we have got one coming up that's going to be just on that, and it is a heavy topic, but it's a really interesting one as well. When you look at Iceland and how so many of the female Icelandic population seems to have come from Ireland in the form of slaves. You could be romantic and say all the Vikings went and fell in love and took them to Iceland, but I highly doubt
Hmm.
it. Um,
But it was already, and it is important to say, like it was already a slave-based economy. So
okay,
it's just that they scale it up,
hmm,
hugely in terms of bringing slaves in and out.
yeah, I think unfortunately, slavery is a story as old as time. It's at the end of the day, you have people who, especially, well, you have it today in the same way of there's work that needs to be done, and people look at it and go, I could do that myself, or I can make this person do it for me. And that's just something that unfortunately I think is just human nature. And as much as I hope we can eradicate it from.
But it's good to know because, people idealize, especially in Ireland, like you're saying, you don't know a lot about kind of Irish medieval history stuff, but people within Ireland or the Irish diaspora, they really romanticize this period of Irish history. And, when you're saying
Mhm,
that people say about, oh, like pagans in Ireland and that it was, and they use the term like Celtic, which isn't a real term, like Celtic is kind of a designation for a language. So like Celtic speaking peoples and Celtic based Celtic languages like Scots Gaelic and Irish and Cornish and Welsh and stuff are Celtic languages. But people talk about, Celtic Ireland, and you have an Enya soundtrack playing. I love Enya, by the way. But that there was this idealized time before,
yeah.
and in our own narratives, how we have framed it here is that there was an idealized time before the English came in. And before the Anglo-Normans came in and fecked it all up, and 800 years of oppression, and it's really important that we don't idealize the Vikings and we don't idealize what these societies were like. Like it wasn't good.
Yeah.
There isn't this perfect white kind of time in history that's homogenous and everybody looked the same, which is often code for white.
Mhm,
And everybody, yeah, lived in this kind of idealized society. And no, it was tough and it was hierarchical and it was patriarchal and
mhm,
women had a tough time and slaves had a horrendous time. And it was also really cosmopolitan and it was also really sophisticated. And
mhm,
you had people creating unbelievable works of art without
yeah.
any of the technology that we have today. And they were creating architecture without any of the technology that we have today. And women were achieving unbelievable things, even though they'd been written out of medieval history.
Yeah.
And even though they didn't have any legal status, and you had people traveling all over the known world at that time. And you had people of different colors in Ireland, or you
Mhm,
people with different ethnic backgrounds in Ireland, and it was really multicultural and it was cosmopolitan. So all of those things can be true
mhm.
at the same
Yeah.
time.
I
And
think
yeah,
that is something that people need to probably remember in all walks of life, that more than one thing can be true at the same time. It doesn't have to be, you know, black or white in a sense of
yeah,
just things don't have to be split and this or that. It can be a mix and a really really complex gray. You can have all the cool things that you love about the Vikings, but you can also have, there was this shitty side to it, and we can't deny that. And just having the foresight to learn that and understand that and go, okay, well, this part was there, but also there's all this real cool stuff and there's really amazing art. There's all this stuff that I like. You can still hold that in high regard, but just be aware of the other side. Don't just try and pretend it doesn't exist. Just educate a little bit on it and go, okay, well, yeah, there was this sucky side too.
yeah.
And it can be a balance. Not everything is just clear cut.
And you don't even like, to me, it's actually not that complicated because all you have to do is accept that it's complex. So you don't have to necessarily understand all the nuance and all the details yourself. You just have to appreciate that there was a lot going on, and also that it was dynamic and that it was always changing. That this whole period wasn't just this one finite, discrete, siloed thing. You know,
Yeah.
that's why I'm kind of saying that it's hard. It is important for us to understand, and that's what a lot of cool scholars are doing now. They're seeing it as like this Irish Sea zone, and that you can't really understand what's going on in like in Dublin without knowing what's going on in York. And you can't understand what's going on with the Great Irish Army in England without understanding what the guys were doing in Ireland. And they're inextricably linked. And Battle of Brunanburh and the Battle of Clontarf in Dublin. And we're creating the binaries. But in fairness, like when you go back to when they first arrived, like the Irish sources are very clear for a long time that they're othering them on purpose. So they're, as I said, they're kind of marking out the people who are coming in, what we call the Vikings. They're calling them heathens and non-Christians and foreigners.
But again, that's that's a tactic that's been used by tons of different cultures to control people or get people to do what they want, because they go, well, they're the other. They're not like us. They don't. All you have to do is find something that's different. So in this case, it's religion. It's like, well, they don't believe our religion, so they're the bad ones.
Yeah, exactly.
Even though I guess they are coming and attacking your land.
they're also killing everybody.
There is also that, but it is that way that you can kind of separate that up. When do we see any correlation as to when the Vikings arrive? Obviously, you've got all these different kings. Is there any kind of collaborative effort to get rid of them? Does that, because I guess it happens in two ways. One, they can manipulate the attackers and use them to attack their, that guy over there that I've really disliked for a long time and I want his land. Or usually it's like, well, we are an Irish people and there is this invasion from the outside, so we now have to stick together.
Yeah, so you get both things going on essentially. So the thing is that some, as I said, so kind of a bit of a potted history. You first kind of written references to loads of like intense raids in the summer on all of those kind of island monasteries is the first phase. But as I said, we have archaeological evidence that there was probably people settled in trading, because they were trading, but long before that, right? Let's say if we start kind of like end of the mid 790s, and then you have this kind of raiding going on for a while. But even in the records of that raiding, you can see that these guys actually kind of knew what they were doing, because they were raiding at the right time of year. They were raiding on kind of like market days or religious festivals. They were getting cattle tribute. They were stealing the cattle tribute, so they knew when the cattle were going to be gathered. So they had insider information. So they weren't just like happening upon these vulnerable communities. So they sail around the whole island and they attack all of the different, pick off all the monasteries, right, over a couple of decades. And they do that to some of them repeatedly.
Yeah.
They don't decimate them. right? Because then they couldn't be attacking them again 2 years later, right? So they don't like burn them completely to the ground, or if they do, they get rebuilt quite quickly. So that's quite interesting in itself, right? You see
Mm.
places being repeatedly raided in quite close time, so they don't just destroy them forever. And then you see that they start to make these kind of overwintering kind of posts, and where,
That
yeah,
that has to be a big shift
yeah,
from going.
yeah,
And again, I think it's something to be aware of, that it probably wasn't always just we'll go attack one monastery, then go back home. It's almost a tour of what we'll go and hit a few different places, get what we can, and then go back. But when you go from that like summer raid into, oh, we're going to stay here now,
yeah,
there has to be some sort of shift of security to
yeah.
be willing, and safety to be able to stay there and go, okay, we now have enough of a foothold in this little area to feel safe enough to just stay.
Yeah, no, exactly. And, there has to be a question asked about, yeah, to what level did they have any agreement that they were allowed to stay in a certain kingdom, because you get those ultimately, and again, I'm giving you the really dumbed down version, but ultimately these
That's
overwinter.
perfect for
Yeah,
me.
that's fine. No, but also it's nicely dumbed down for me so that I don't have to try and fake it into too much detail. But these overwintering camps, some of them ultimately develop into places like Dublin. Okay, so massive international cities as we know it today. Um, so it happens gradually. Essentially, it's not an overnight thing. It takes it's taken a few decades, right? Um, and then those, as I said, those camps develop into kind of more solid trading posts, where they're not
Mhm.
just overwintering, where they're kind of like more permanent posts. And then you start to see big inroads down the rivers, and again, the way it's described in the Irish annals, and you just don't have this to the same extent for the English medieval sources. There's so much detail in these annals at this period. And the annals are essentially like records of yearly events, like all the big headline news. Essentially, this king died, this bishop died, this battle happened, and there was snow in May. You know,
Okay.
um, that kind of thing. And so the Vikings just become like a really big deal in all of
Hmm.
these records. So you see, like it says, like 30 ships down the River Boyne and 30 ships down the River Liffey. And these two rivers, if you look at them on a map of Ireland, it's kind of like this pincer movement where there's this one river that's kind of going through kind of modern County Meath and other counties as well. And the Liffey is where it enters the sea at Dublin. Um, and they're both going into this like agricultural heartland, which is the richest part of the country because we didn't have the kind of the center of Ireland, or the kind of a lot of the big places were actually in the middle, whereas now they're on the coasts,
Well, yeah.
thanks to the Vikings. So yeah, you just see this big pincer movement where they're sending essentially like, like 120 ships, like these massive fleets. And there
Hmm.
might have been a bit of hyperbole there, but they're sent, they're making, and then you see all these records. You see the first records, and I think it might be 841 to a named Viking leader. And they probably knew the names of different Viking leaders before this, but this guy becomes a really big deal. Turgeis in Irish, or probably Thorgils in
Okay.
Norse, Turgesius in the Latin sources, because the sources were written in Latin and in Irish. And uh, he goes around, and you just see like Turgeis attacks here, and Turgeis gets kidnaps all of these people here, and
Hmm.
you're just reading it, and you're like, oh my God, this guy is some dude.
Yeah.
And he starts working with different Irish leaders. But to kind of ultimately get back to what you asked me, which was, was there any kind of concerted effort to keep them out? What you see actually, and there was, right, but it's complex. So Turgeis gets Irish allies, right, and they use. So as I said, like you'll have a king in Leinster who will ally with the Viking leader with all of his men against his Irish rival because he ultimately wants more land for himself, the Irish king.
Yeah.
So
It's that self greed, isn't it? Over.
but they let them in. But interestingly, what you never get is the Vikings just don't make the territorial inroads that they do in England. So you will you'll ally anyway, they make different alliances, and then kind of if we skip way on to, and we're getting to, so then you get anyway, you when we were talking about the different terms used, kind of lots of exciting stuff happens in the 840s, and you see references to like the king of the foreigners comes over and lashes the foreigners in Dublin out of it and tells them all to cop on and brings them to heel. And you can see that the Irish chronicler is like, oh my God, so much stuff happened. This guy came down from Norway and was like, what are you guys doing? And you can see, you get all these insights that like these Vikings, that they're not united either. So they're all different factions also,
Yeah.
Scandinavia. And you get reference to the Dovgal, right? The dark foreigners come and they start fighting the Fingal, the fair foreigners, right? And people have traditionally associated Fingal with with Norwegians, and of course, you know, you didn't have like a centralized kind of like kingdom of Norway at that time, but and then Dovgal with the Danes, right? And it's
I
not
wonder if that could that be hair color?
well, it's funny because loads of people used to say that it was, but now people have shown that no, if you look at the other Irish texts, you can see that Finn and Dov, so fair and dark, are actually used to mean new and old. So it's essentially the Irish chronicler is saying the new far
Oh.
yeah, the you know, the old foreigners, the fair foreigners, these other guys come in, which is like probably the Danes.
Yeah.
And then they pick up, it all blows up, right? And it's again, it's fascinating reading it from the Irish sources because ultimately you get infighting and stuff later on between the Viking leaders in Ireland. So they can't get you know, their stuff together in Ireland to even be centralized and united themselves against the Irish, right? And then you have like the Limerick Vikings start to grow in power and the Dublin Vikings start to grow in power, and they're not simpatico at all, the Limerick Vikings and the Dublin Vikings, not all the time anyway. So again, that's used. So then near Limerick, which is in the west of Ireland, you have different Irish leaders allying there or fighting them. And so at no point is it this big concerted centralized effort. At no point do the Vikings invade Ireland. And at no point is there some big, you know, kind of attack that you can centralize and have one force against another force. It's different people. The Vikings that are coming in themselves aren't united. Then you get these three named Vikings come in: Ursula, Ivar, who's potentially Ivar the Boneless, and Olaf. And Olaf and Ivar, the two of them, they kind of end up being, they're in some sources, these three guys are kind of described as allies, and in others it's implied that they could be brothers in some shape or form. But they kind of go around rampaging around Ireland. But again, they make big inroads at different times. But then you will have the King of Meath, like the King of Tara, defeats them at various times, and they push them back. And basically, essentially, again, dumbing the whole thing out, they keep on getting pushed back to their strongholds. They keep on getting pushed back to Dublin and to Limerick and to Cork, you know. So they just don't make these big inroads into the big, you know, agricultural, you know, areas in the interior. They keep on getting pushed back to their kind of strongholds on the coast. And then Ivar the Boneless, you see, you know, even you see those three lads then active. They kind of get pushed out of Ireland a bit in the 860s. You get some infighting after they leave. They feel, I think what it looks like in the sources that they feel like they're leaving. They make some good gains around kind of the east of Ireland, and Dublin is in really good nick. And they're like, okay, let's go now and return. Let's try and get this place next door is way bigger. We've had a crack at it a couple of times and we haven't done anything great. And they go over to England, and the rest is history there, you know, make massive inroads in England, and in their absence, that the Dublin Vikings start fighting with each other. And then you get this big, a lot of stuff goes on over the decades, Daniel. And then you get this big, seen as this massive, definitive like line in Irish history, in Irish Viking history, which is the expulsion of the Dublin Vikings in 902. Now, that in itself, again, is...
It's quite early then compared to
Yes, this
You
is
call
yes,
1066 would be
yes.
the British.
So in Ireland, it's all earlier, and as I'm
Mm,
saying, they're cutting their teeth in Ireland, right? And they're fighting in Ireland, and they're getting a lot of they're getting a lot of wealth and trade out of Ireland because what it looks like to me, because in my own research, I'm doing this big research project on Clonard. It's just a place in what's County Meath, but it was near the centre of the kind of the power of Ireland at the time, near Tara and you the King of Meath was kind of a big deal. And you can just see how some of these guys actually were making a lot of money out of the Vikings.
mhm,
So some of them were quite quickly using the Vikings as mercenaries to defeat their own enemies.
mhm,
And some of them were like, we actually like having this town there on our border. Dublin as well, it's quite interesting. It's actually on the border between two dynasties and between two areas. And it seems to be that must have been intentional that they got a stronghold there because it kind of suited both sides. It wasn't really taking anyone's kind of territory necessarily. And they were feeding into the economy. And so the area that I'm doing this research project on and the big dynasty around the area is called the Clan Colmon, but they get really rich, really, really rich in the 800s. And there's these all of these silver hoards and everything, and it's all it's tied into the Vikings. So they
mhm.
actually had a vested interest. So it's, as you said, it's way earlier, really quick in Ireland. They become part of the power structures and that economy. So it's quite complex. But when you talk about do they come together to kind of battle the Vikings? Yes, they do. So one of the big key dates is 902, where you have people around the different kings ally together, kings that wouldn't have allied in the past. Okay.
Mhm.
So and kind of a newish alliance to get rid of the Vikings.
Is there an event that kicks that off?
So uh, it's a bit of a slow burn, right? Because there's a bit of a power vacuum and there's infighting. So what you see if you're looking in the annals, you see this Viking guy, Sihtric and Barad, and all of these Dublin Vikings are fighting each other, right? And
Right.
then the Irish kings are like, do you know what? They're doing actually a fairly poor job of running Dublin, and we actually like how much money Dublin is making us. So why don't we just kick these foreigners out of our country, and why don't we take on Dublin,
Mhm.
as a going
So
concern?
was Dublin such a powerhouse before the Vikings came, or did they make it into
They, yeah,
this
they
big
made it.
city?
Yeah, they made it into what it is today, essentially.
Okay.
And as you said, it's so much earlier. So in 902, this big event, right? But actually, it really isn't a big event. They come together. They push those guys out. But Dublin continues. We know from the archaeological evidence. If you only read the written sources, you might think that they say like all of the Vikings were expelled.
Yeah.
But it's only the leaders, and then they go and have lots of fun in Francia and in England and
Mm-hmm.
other places. But then you get again the sense of foreboding because in 912 and 914 and ultimately 917, 918, the Vikings come back and they are directly related to like Olaf and Ivar the Boneless, and they're their sons and then they're their grandsons. And when you think about it, actually some of these guys when they were expelled, so they might have been like kind of princes for want of a better word, like they would have been kind of like you know, children of the Viking royalty in Dublin at the
Mm-hmm.
time in 902, they might have only known Dublin. They might have been born there. And
Yeah,
they were
exactly.
at this stage they were intermarrying into Irish aristocracy for 50 years, right?
Hmm.
So they would have been bilingual, they would have had an
Yeah,
Irish mother and she would have been she could have been an aristocratic princess.
yeah.
You have so many records of that. And then you also have like the relating allying with aristocracy in the Hebrides and Orkney and Shetland and all, like all the Scottish Isles. And there's a really complex kind of aristocratic network going on.
Hmm.
So when those guys, when you see them coming back, and again, you see like fleets, it's fleets on the river, right? There's Viking fleets and Viking ships coming in. And um, I can just imagine those guys. They're like, that's my inheritance. I'm coming
Yeah,
back. I'm taking Waterford back. I'm taking
yeah.
Dublin back. I
It's
was
also
born there.
their, yeah, it's their home
They're home.
as much as it is. And I think that's one thing that, we need to remember, that it's so easy to look back on history as these snapshot moments and just like quick little things. And you can jump forward 100 years and just in 2 minutes of discussion and forget that it's 100 years. That's multiple generations. So there's people who, like I say, that's all they know. Probably all their parents knew. So it's when you get to that point, it's 2-3 generations down. It's like, oh well, this is my home. I was born here. I was raised here. I've done everything. Lived my life here. I've helped support the ecosystem. So, and now you've kicked me out.
Yeah.
Well, fuck you. I'm coming back to take back where I was happy.
And they don't go to Scandinavia. They stay around, that whole Irish Sea zone, or they go down to.
They've probably never been to Scandinavia.
Never been to, but they're speaking all Norse, right? And then they have, as you said, like they have probably the faith, the art, the jewelry, all that kind of thing. Like we see that in all the archaeology, so they had their customs. So I think culturally they were probably very, in inverted commas, Scandinavian. But then, as I said, the guys at the top, they were married into the Irish aristocracy as well, so they were both. And again, what I think is really interesting in this is you have the elites at the top, and they have more in common with each other, even if they speak different languages, than they do with the slaves at the bottom.
Yeah, it's a class system, isn't it?
Right, it's the class system. So, but then you have this big battle. If I skip forward again, you have this really huge battle, which is very cool. In well, it's not cool, but in 919, where the King of Tara, this big important Enail, this big family, this big Enail king, he marches around Ireland. He comes the whole way from the north of Ireland down to Munster, the whole way down to Waterford when this fleet arrives, right, in Waterford to come back, these guys who had been expelled. And he is like, no, we're not letting you back in. Not a hope. Marches a massive army down, accrues more soldiers on his side, more allies as he comes down, and he tries to unite Ireland, all the kings against these guys, and they end up having a massive. So this kind of starts in 914 and goes on for about 5 years around different parts of Ireland, and it ends up in a massive battle in the year 919 in Dublin called the Battle of Island Bridge, and the Vikings win.
Oh, wow,
it's a huge battle, and loads of, if you just read the annal entry, the annal entries are usually really short, but the annal entry is quite long because it's like, this king died, this king's son died, this king's grandson died, this other king died, the king of this died, the king of this died, the king of there. Because one of the really important things in medieval Ireland is that kings, you had to prove your worth by fighting in battle. So that's all good and everything, except you have a battle that you lose and all the kings are dead. So the rest is history from that point on. From 919 onwards, it's kind of like the kind of Viking Dublin and the Viking kind of towns kind of growing in strength. And then if we just skip forward massively because we're out of time, our version of 1066 is 1014. And it's the Battle of Clontarf. And in the Irish literature and in the Norse literature, so Niall Saga, it's a really big deal. Niall Saga loves the Battle of Clontarf. But also in this Irish kind of version it's called the Cugga Gael Galibh, which means the War of the Irish against the foreigners. And what's fascinating about this to me is that in 1014, who are the foreigners? These lads have never been, they've never stepped foot out of Dublin, and it's this big literary epic. And one of the Irish fighters, one of the great Irish heroes, is literally called the Hector of Ireland, like Hector was to Troy, Mercury was to Ireland, and it's a very literary text, but it frames it as they're the foreigners and we defeated them in 1014. But that isn't what happened in reality. It was really complex. It was, they were all interrelated. And I kind of have to remind people that a year or 10 years or 20 years or a generation is just as long. It was just as long in the Middle Ages as it is now.
Yeah, exactly.
When you've been living somewhere for 100 and 200 years, because these guys in 1014, like some of them are descended from the Vikings that came in like the 850s. So they'd been there in Ireland for.
Yeah, it's like, I'm sure there's loads of people listening to this, particularly probably in America, in the United States. What the United States was, the Constitution was what, 1776? I'm hoping my maths is good there. My memory of dates. So that's what, 300 years So it's almost going back to people who people who were around at the time of the forming of the United States of America, and going, oh well, you've been here this whole time, but now you're a foreigner, so off you go.
And then again, it's how people, it's the elites and the aristocracy and politically, and the guys at the top are probably speaking a few languages. As I said, you have an Irish mom and so we kind of skipped over there, but maybe for discussion for another day. But Dublin during that period when Dublin and York becomes kind of part of the one kind of kingdom, so for different parts, you have the king kind of Olaf as one of the key guys, different guys they're king of both places at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And that's their kingdom. So their kingdom starts in Dublin. So that's their kind of like their westerly point of their kingdom, and their kingdom stretches across the Irish Sea, and they control the seas.
Yeah, okay.
So it's a part of it, and then it goes over. Do you know what I mean? So it's part of.
It's not separate, yeah.
No, and Dublin and York are part of this one world, and when they're having difficulties with the kings in Ireland, they pay more attention to what's going on around York and vice versa.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Let's wrap this one up because I feel like we could talk for forever, and I do want to give chance for people to do a little Q&A after and ask you some questions. So yeah, let's wrap this up. I have a few questions I want to ask you in the Q&A as well, because we said at the top of the show we were going to get into the term Anglo-Saxon.
Yeah.
So we'll touch on that a little bit in the Q&A. Where can people find you, listen to you more if they want to tune into your podcast?
Yeah, exactly. So the Medieval Irish History podcast, I try to cover a lot of these topics in it, and I interview a different kind of academic. It's every 2 weeks. We're on kind of summer break at the minute, but I have a episode on the Vikings where I interviewed Claire Downham, who's kind of like the historical expert on this. Professor Claire Downham. She's in the University of Liverpool. She's amazing. But lots of other things, like the episode on the Battle of Clontarf and all the incestuous relationships that were going on, and who were the Vikings, and a lot on Queens and lots of different topics. Patrick, Bridget, early Irish law.
Yeah, wonderful. And like I say, I would love to do this again on just Ireland, Irish history. It's something I would love to know more about. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about it. So we will book that in and do one separate to the Vikings, just about Irish history.
Yeah, great.
Do you have any public social media that you want people to follow, or are you quite?
No, I have to. I'm not great. I'm just on X.
On X.
Formerly known as Twitter.
I was gonna say
one of the last people. It's still there.
Yeah, I think you're one of the first people I've ever heard just call it X outright and not just go Twitter first.
Yeah. I should kind of get on Instagram and stuff. But if anybody's interested in the cult of relics in medieval Ireland, I have a book on that. And I do kind of different blog articles and stuff. I suppose the main thing is to check out the podcast, and there's kind of links in all the different episodes.
Perfect. That's the Medieval Irish History Podcast.
Yeah.
Perfect. If anyone wants to follow me, it's Daniel_Farrand1 on Instagram, Horns of Odin, and then obviously Nordic Mythology Podcast across the board. And you get to see all our pretty faces on YouTube as we put all the episodes on there. If you want to check that out, hit the little like and subscribe button. And yeah, let's wrap this up, and we will do a little Q&A. People want that. Again, it's on our Patreon.